Hi, I'm Chris Jackson. I'm the publisher and editor-in-chief at One World Books and also the editor of The Sum of Us by Heather McGhee. So Heather, just to start, can you just, for people who don't know, tell us what is The Sum of Us?
The Sum of Us is a book that I wrote to try to answer the question, why does it seem like we can't have nice things in America? And by nice things, I don't mean like laundry that does itself. I mean nice things like universal affordable health care and paid family leave and world-class infrastructure and wages that keep workers out of poverty. I mean the types of things that really provide for a decent standard of living for this country of such hardworking people. And in order to answer that question, which I kind of tried to do over nearly 20 years working as a public policy wonk at a think tank, researching, using statistical analysis and data, I sort of left that role out of a little bit of frustration, feeling like there were these invisible headwinds holding us back from making what seemed like obvious economic decisions to improve most people's quality of life. So I set out on this journey over the course of 3 years. I went from California to Mississippi to Maine and back again multiple times. And I came upon these core concepts through talking to really hundreds of people, dozens of whom end up in the book, that really helped explain a little bit better that ultimately it's racism in our politics and our policymaking that is keeping us all from having nice things. And therefore, it's not actually a zero sum. It's not the case that what's good for one group is necessarily bad for the other. It's not the case that progress for people of color has to come at white folks' expense. And that idea that the zero sum is this lie that is holding back our collective progress is one that I wanted to tackle head on. That's what the sum of us means. It's about interrupting this lie, refuting this lie of the zero sum racial story. And the central metaphor at the heart of the book is the story of the drained public pool, which is what happened across the country to many of the lavishly funded public swimming pools that really stand in as sort of an idea of government's commitment to the public good, to saying, you know what, this would be great for people, let's do it. Let's make a swimming pool. Let's make Social Security and high wages and high levels of unionization and free college and all of these things that we did create in the first half of the 20th century, but we made them segregated and racially exclusive, like the public swimming pools, which often had a whites only sign. And it was when we integrated the pools, when black families said, you know what, those are our tax dollars funding those public goods, and we think our kids should swim too, that many towns and cities drained their public swimming pools rather than integrate them. And for me, the story of that loss, which was a loss shared across a community out of racial spite and out of this zero-sum fear of sharing a public good, really helps to explain how we got to this place, where so much of what we hold in common is impoverished, where our politics are very anti-government, and it makes us sort of stand apart of our peer economies. And yet the book is hopeful. The book is hopeful because just as in my journey I found evidence of the zero sum, I found evidence of drained pool politics and things like universal health care and our rising student debt and our lack of free college, the attack on workers' rights, all these ways that racism stops us from taking collective action and really problem solving together. I also found examples of the exact opposite happening, mostly in communities where grassroots collections of people from all walks of life came together to fight for the things that we simply can't accomplish on our own. And I began to call that idea the Solidarity Dividend, the idea of these gains that can be unlocked, but only when we come together across lines of race, things like higher wages and cleaner air and better funded schools. And it's those solidarity dividends that give me a lot of hope at the local level and, you know, right now from where we sit at the national level. So much of the progress that we've been able to make economically, U.S. poverty rate is the lowest level it's been on record in 2021, is because of a multiracial coalition that came together. And so I'm really excited to talk to you about the book. The book has changed my life in so many ways. It's helped me think about some things that I've always wanted to think about and talk to some people across the country that really changed the way I see the world.
That's really fantastic. So it's been a year since the book came out, and hundreds of thousands of people we know have read the book, which is kind of amazing to think about. Back when we were first starting to work on it, that it would be so widespread throughout the country. And I have a few questions from some of our readers that we're going to talk about. But I want to start actually with one more broad question. What have you found has been the response to readers when they read the book? I know we've shared some of those responses that we've seen on social media and so forth, but what's your general impression of how people respond to it, or what they respond to in it?
Yeah, I mean, it's been amazing. This is my first book, so far my only book, and I think I didn't realize how much the medium of a book, the format, is so different from all the other ways I've been communicating over the past 20 years. I go on TV all the time, I do legislative testimony, I write white papers, all these other things that are just not as intimate and personal, that don't stay with you as long. There's something about a book, I think, that really, you when you're reading it to yourself, you're taking my words and they're entering your consciousness through your own inner voice. And I think that can be very powerful. What I love that people really pick up from the book are the stories. This book is not an economics textbook, although it's about an economic policy person trying to figure out big problems in the American economy. It has stories of people, people who in their lives and in describing their lives and what happens to them really show and reveal what's wrong with the American economy and how we can fix it, and how racism has played a role in shaping these dynamics. Stories like Bridget Hughes, a fast food worker who is white and changes her consciousness about immigrants and people of color in order to join with them to win in the fight for $15 in a union. People like the Tomlins, who are a black elderly family in North Carolina who almost lose their home but fight to keep it, and that of so many others around them during the run-up to the financial crisis. Those stories are, I think, what stick with people. The metaphor of the drained pool, right? It's kind of a haunting image, and it really is, I think, for some people like an aha of like, yes, I know that in our society today, what is public is usually worse, right? It's usually run down, it's usually starved for resources. But why should that be? Shouldn't it be that things that are public, that are for all of us and funded by all of us, should be palaces? And I think that idea has resonated with folks. Another response to the book has been that people appreciate that it's hopeful, because there's so much bad news about race and racism, and the book is full of, I don't pull any punches about the extent of racism in our society, and yet I'm a hopeful person, and the stories I tell are ultimately hopeful ones.
So let's get into some questions. These are questions from people who are readers of the book. Of many, many questions that we received from them, we're just going to go through 3 of those today. Okay, so here comes the first one. Was there an aspect to your writing process where you revised and edited in an attempt to reach readers who were reluctant to delve into issues of race? And can you talk about that process? And you talk about the fact that, obviously there's so much negative information or depressing information or despairing information about race that can be a turnoff for people, even those who are motivated to do something about it. So what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I was hoping you would help me remember this a little bit too as my editor. I mean, we had so many conversations. I mean, I remember very vividly coming in with the book proposal and meeting you for the first time. And I remember you said to me, there's a tension in your book between self-interest and empathy. And I really struck as a very smart thing to say, Chris. But it was also, that core tension, I think, is one that I tried to really play with and get the right balance of throughout the book. The Sum of Us is definitely a kind of radical and disciplined exercise in empathy for me as a writer. There were moments when I was deep into the history of slavery, deep into the history of redlining, segregation, and lynching, and I mean, it's just so dark, and yet I knew that where I wanted to go was ultimately a place where the horrors of that did not make me, I just had to substitute myself for the reader, did not make me unwilling to go on the journey. And I also felt like at every point I wanted to see if where we're trying to go as a society is a place where we truly recognize our common humanity and where the things that make us human, right? The stories that we have about the first time anybody ever loved us, about feeling seen, about feeling belonging. Like those are really what make us human. If that's where we want to go as a society, where those touchstones are points of connection, then I felt like I needed to try as much as possible in my writing to be in that space and to put myself in the shoes of every character in my book, even, you know, politicians doing terrible things, even, you know, people doing terrible things. And so that sort of exercise of empathy was definitely, I did sort of empathy reads of my own text sort of over and over again to think, okay, if I'm reading this as this kind of person, how does this land? I just didn't take for granted that the body that I sit in, the life that I have lived, is everybody else's life. And so since communication is both what you say and what's heard, I wanted to try to think about who would be hearing it and how it might, what I said could actually land with them in a way that touched them.
Well, it's interesting because you're Black, and so am I, and I was your editor. But there are other people, surely, who you had read the book who were not.
Yeah.
Were they able to kind of help you sort of navigate that sort of like trying to land it for all kinds of readers?
Absolutely. I had someone from every major racial and ethnic group in the country read the book, who were my friends and collaborators, research assistants, and just other writer friends, my husband, right? All these different voices. And then more importantly, also like people whose familiarity with race text and with racial history was different, right? And so sort of people who were on a different place in the journey. One of my girlfriends who read the book entirely really started out like, you know, like so many white people, like, you know, hadn't spent a ton of time thinking critically about race and about whiteness and how it functions in society. Good person, super interpersonally anti-racist, right? But not at all sort of immersed in the theory and the intellectual body, and hadn't, you know, ever gone through a process to really do the work. And so in some ways reading drafts of my book was that process. So it was amazing to watch her go through it and watch her sort of resistance fade, and also for her to tell me, you know, I'm on page through, you know, whatever, and like my ears are hot and my throat is tight, right? And it's making it hard for me to get to the next page, and you know, that's really important stuff. But mostly, like, I love people, and I wanted people to have a certain emotional experience reading the book, and so it wasn't like cold calculation. It was sort of a sense of, can I keep the relationship with all of my readers throughout the book? And I wanted people to read it in multiracial groups. So I also would picture, like, you know, a church group or a book club that had people of different faiths and backgrounds trying to get into this text together and wanting everybody to have something in it.
Yeah, no, I think that's really the key to the book, is I think you can tell, as a reader, you can tell that you're not pandering to any particular point of view or any racial group. There's so much integrity in what you write, but there's like doors open everywhere for anyone to enter into the story, which I think is so important, where you don't budge at all on your argument, but you nevertheless like make it available and open to anyone who comes to it in good faith. And so I think that worked. All right, so our next question is, on the people who most need to read this book will never be open-minded enough to actually read it. What are some potential leading or critical thinking questions I can ask them to get them to think about some of the issues that you explain in your book? There's some premises in this question that are interesting, but what do you think?
Well, the premise that the people who most need to read the book wouldn't, I hope is not the case. It hasn't been my experience that it's the case. I've gotten plenty of emails from, you know, whose emails that say, I'm a white male Republican, I'm 70 years old, I've held these kinds of beliefs my whole life, and I read your book and it really made me see things differently, which are, you know, just gold to me and truly wonderful and moving things to receive. but I get the idea. Yes, right. That we have become so polarized on issues not just of race and racism, but of talking about race and racism. Really, because of this zero-sum idea, right? That if talking about racism will lead to something that's good for black people, it must be bad for white people. Or lead to something that's good, or people of color want it, it must mean a loss for white people. And so I think in some ways, by naming that zero-sum mentality and asking, so if I'm trying to reach someone who, if I'm trying to convince someone to read the book, maybe who holds that zero-sum view or whose politics, that's sort of the core story of their politics, just naming it, because in some ways, just saying, do you really believe that in order for there to be equality, white people are going to be worse off? Or in order for a black or brown family down the road to have their American dream, you have to lose yours? Like that, actually just letting that idea breathe and putting a name to it, I think is really important, because it doesn't sound good, right? It sounds wrong. And yet it's such a core part of the right-wing narrative. And so having that conversation at the level of that concept, and maybe seeing places where someone could actually disagree with the zero-sum might be a good way to start. How do you explain why nearly half of American workers are low paid, and why 1% of the population owns more wealth than the entire middle class, and why politicians who campaign on cultural grievance get into power and govern on tax cuts for the wealthy? How do you explain how we went from having a strong middle class that was mostly white to having a more diverse country, and the policies and rules have completely changed to make it so much easier for people to get rich and so much harder for working people to get by? How do you explain that? What's your story? Those are some of the questions that I might ask. And then the pool story. People tend to like the pool story, and it is a head scratcher for why towns and cities would drain their public pools rather than integrate them. And is there anything like that in our current society today?
I find when I talk to people about the book, that is the entry point. And I think what's interesting about the question too is it raises another question, which is, who most needs the book, right? And I think there's probably an assumption within that question that, oh, well, some conservative, right-wing, white person needs the book. But it's a mystery for all of us, and there's a resistance, I think, that a lot of people, even people who, you might, think of as being liberal, even people of color, there's a resistance to the idea that could racism actually be the problem? That explains not just why black people suffer and are, disproportionately beaten and killed by the police, but that actually explains everything. It seems like a leap for, I think, a lot of people to get there. And I think you're right that the drain pool story definitely starts to focus them, because they start to realize maybe even something as simple as, the privatization of swimming pools in America can be explained through racism.
And then the metaphor of the drain pool, when you start to say, okay, why don't we have universal health care? It would require a massive role for government. People understand, I think, that there's a lot of resistance to Obamacare because it was brought to the country or signed by the first black president. Things like universal free public college. People really do understand that it used to be free and the government used to pick up the tab, and what happened? Why? It's not like it became less important to have a college degree, right? So some of these things that are sort of head scratchers. Why were unions so strong and created this robust middle class for which everyone is nostalgic from right to left, and yet now we have some of the lowest unionization rates of our peer economies, and why, right? Because it requires collective action. And often, collective action falls apart in a multiracial society. The other thing that is a different assumption about who needs to read the book is, my emphasis on the power of multiracial organizing and coalitions is something that some people of color don't necessarily, that's hard for some of us to wrap our minds around. The idea that black folks are just 13% of the population, and ultimately, like, all of the moments of great progress in this country have come through multiracial coalitions, led by black people, sacrificed the most for by black people, but never alone. We've never had the power to change all of the laws in the country on our own, and so that's something that I think I've heard from people of color, particularly in this moment in the country of such, powerful black consciousness, that a reminder of the sort of sense of mutual interest in overcoming, and that it's not a zero sum, is actually important too.
Right, and I think it's one of the disarming things about the book is that you start by acknowledging that this was not necessarily the first answer that you came to either, that it was something that you were thinking, okay, economics is economics, and obviously you're very aware of and steeped in like the history of racism in this country, but bringing those two things together in the way that the book ultimately does was something that you came to yourself.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I try to solve these problems through data. I try to solve these problems by just working on these problems, right? It's like, let us solve the problem of unaffordable college. Let us solve the problem of poverty wages. And yet race kept being this sort of invisible headwind. And finally I said, you know what? I've got to figure this out. I've got to figure out just how much racism in our politics and policymaking is actually the answer to the inexplicable why of inequality in America.
If a local community wants to research and share local incidents of the history you describe in order to work toward reparation, what are some examples to follow? And maybe before you answer that, you can talk a little bit about what the questioner's talking about in the book.
Yeah, so first, I mean, throughout the book, I include a little bit of history. I'm not an historian, and yet I felt like to understand where we are today, the economy and the society of today, I had to look a little bit towards what were the decisions that made this possible. And so there is history in every chapter, and there is the history of explicit racial policies that end up distorting our society in one way or another, with implications for all of us. And so, the history of redlining shows up a lot in the book, the idea that history shows up in your wallet through wealth, through your home equity, your savings, the fact that a black college graduate has less wealth on average than a white high school dropout, not because of what that black college graduate did or didn't do, but because of explicitly racist decisions generations ago. That is the history that needs to be owned up to, revealed, understood, if we're to have something other than racist explanations for the disparities today. Right? And so I think what the book club member who raised that question is asking, how do we find that local history? Because it really is it's a local history. Right. It's a history of place, it's a history of space. And in the final chapter of the book, I introduce a concept called the Truth, Racial Healing, and Transformation process. And I talked to folks in Dallas who have written a community history that is a race-forward community history of their city that explains so many of these decisions. And how would one go about doing that? It's such a great question. I'm really glad that someone wants to do it, and there's been that response to the book. Let's do this in our hometown. So first of all, there are one of the core ideas with the Truth, Racial Healing, and Transformation process. It's a whole framework. People can find the guidebook on healourcommunities.org. Is that you want to gather a team, that you don't want to just do it alone. You want to get sort of stakeholders from lots of different parts of your community to be sort of the coalition of the willing to do this process. And I think that's important even if you're not doing specifically a TRHT thing, but just bring together people of all sort of neighborhoods and backgrounds from your community to try to write this story together. Local universities are obviously a resource. There are going to be ethnic studies and urban studies professors and departments that can help. There are two resources out of the University of Richmond called Mapping Inequality, which has all of the country's redlining maps. And you can really actually see the neighborhood where I was born, it said high concentration of Negroes, do not lend, right? Hazardous. And then there's a newer resource at the University of Richmond called Renewing Inequality, which shows the maps of all of the urban renewal projects, which were how Black and brown neighborhoods got designated as blighted slums in order to place highways through them in the 1950s and 60s. And that's another very economically and socially traumatic event that had destroyed Black wealth. And so those are two resources to find out, where these racist decisions shaped your community. In general, I think because this book has taught me that the fingerprints of racism are on so many areas of policy, what I've been really buoyed by has been hearing people who've read the book say, I read the book and I decided to work on how our schools are funded. I read the book and I decided to work on a permit that was about to be granted for, an incinerator, and it was going to be in the, Latino neighborhood. Like all of these little things, how our taxes are collected, where the public recreation and swimming pools and playgrounds and green spaces are. There's so many places where these decisions have a racial implication, are shot through with racial bias, and less communities come together and call the question.
That's great, and I think that's one of the real powers of the book is that, I think what a great book will do is actually explain things to you, like explain the things that are happening in the world right now, will explain the daily news to you. And I think reading this book, you start to really understand so much of what's going on in our national politics, but also locally. And just going back to that question that the reader had, you talk about these kinds of processes of truth and reconciliation, although you don't say truth and reconciliation, you say
racial healing and transformation. This is actually really important because truth and reconciliation isn't appropriate for our context. Right. We were founded to be separate and apart. So reconcile means to come back together from some original state of being together. We don't need to reconcile, go back. We need to transform. And that's why my mother, Dr. Gail Christopher, who was the architect of that whole process that's happening in dozens of cities, chose racial healing and transformation and not reconciliation.
Right, and that is a precondition in some ways to a lot of the other changes that we're looking to happen on a national level.
Yeah, I do think that consciousness raising, that understanding, as I say in the book, to get on the same page before we can turn it, that's really necessary. And that's why there's this war about history right now, about what words we get to say, what's about our children's freedom to learn, because the fear is that we will understand, is that our children will develop empathy, is that we will question the stereotypes and the demonization of people who are suffering, and we will begin to put responsibility where it belongs, which is with the narrow self-interested elite, the sort of descendants of the plantation class, either literally, as is often the case, or just sort of ideologically. When we understand each other's history and plight, when we understand our collective history, I do believe that it makes us less willing to believe the lies today.
Right, okay, excellent. Well, thank you so much.
Thank you, Chris.